Working Cows Podcast, episode 209.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network, here with another episode for you guys. Very excited to be joined today by Margaret Byfield. Margaret is an individual who is involved with analyzing and pushing back against the 30 by 30 agenda, 30 by 30 land grab, however you want to phrase that. And she has been doing this work really her whole life. Of course, this agenda is new, but it isn't totally new. It's been around. These ideas have been around, and these strategies have been around in different places for a long time. And so she has been involved in this work for a long time. And so at the recommendation of some listeners, I have reached out to her and got her on to help us understand what's going on, what's at stake, and how we can prepare ourselves to protect the lands that have been entrusted to us for our management and for our improvement. So, Margaret, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
And a couple of regular listeners, of the listeners to this podcast, there are very few that I've met face to face, but a couple of them that I have met face to face, very much respect, have been after me for a while to get you on the podcast. I think maybe even before you spoke at the RCAF convention, and maybe dating back to the meeting in Nebraska even. So I guess where we should start probably is just kind of get a little bit of your history, a little bit of your history with this fight, if we want to call it that, and then talk a little bit about what the 30 for 30 or 30 by 30 is all about. So we'll just start with your history, I guess.
Well, sure. Well, I was raised on a ranch in central Nevada, and my family ended up involved in a very big property rights case. It was the first ever federal lands grazing takings case filed in the U.S. Court of Claims, federal claims. So, we purchased the ranch in 1991. It was one of the key targets of the environmental movement at that time. And we owned all the water that was gravity flow to Vegas and gravity flow to Los Angeles. So there were just a lot of reasons to get the rancher off the land. So we fell into that mix. We ended up fighting them for about 13 years there on the ground. Pretty successfully. We won every round with them. They'd cancel our grazing permit, and we would challenge that in the administrative court, or the administrative process, and we'd win it. We went through three of those. But by the fourth one, my parents finally just said, we're never going to win fighting against the regulations. We really need to put the question to the courts as to what does the Western rancher own and what doesn't he own. So on our operation, it was a combination in Nevada, which is very typical of your private-based property, the properties that were homesteaded in early settlement, and then you graze the surrounding lands. That makes up your federal allotments. And Nevada being 87% federal, you really cannot run an operation without having a sizable amount of federal land as part of your operation. That means you have the federal government as your business partner in really everything you do. So that's really where we felt the pressures. The environmental community was really pushing the administration to go cattle-free by 93. We got caught up in all of that. And that's where our case came out of. So, we bought that ranch, I was 10 years old. And when we filed the case and we started Stewards of the Range, which is now American Stewards of Liberty, I think I was 24. So been at this for quite a while. I'm now in my 50s. So for 30 years have been fighting these issues and really fighting for the landowner. I think what people really need to understand, and what the public has forgotten, and our younger public has not been educated on, is how important property rights are to our liberties. It's because we can own property that we have control of our other liberties, that we have the right to defend ourselves, the right to grow our food, the right to own land, the right to security. All of our other liberties are dependent on that property right. And on this 30 by 30 issue that we're going to talk about, we've kind of gotten into a tussle with the National Rifle Association because they took a position supporting 30 by 30. And, again, that shows the lack of education and awareness. A gun right is a property right. And the NRA shouldn't sell out one constitutional right for another. And that's kind of where we got on that. But and we could talk about that a little later. But it really is that history, growing up in ranching, coming from the land, understanding the importance of property rights to our freedoms, that has led us into this work on the property rights issues and on to 30 by 30 for this season.
And I guess what sticks out to me there from your story is that it would seem to be a pretty misguided idea that we don't want any livestock in the watershed that's feeding Las Vegas and Los Angeles. I mean, that they're doing good things for the land if they're properly managed, and so it's going to make the waterways more healthy. It's going to make those things better if we're properly interfacing livestock with the land. So I guess maybe that's we're talking 28 years ago now, 30 years ago now, in 1991. But I guess has there been any change on that, or is that still kind of the same motivation as far as livestock are not good for the land?
Well, I think that argument is actually the ruse. That's the red herring, the conservation side of it, trying to convince people that cattle are bad for the land. What we're talking about, what my family went through, what we're talking about on 30 by 30 is about control. It's not about conservation. And my dad said this way back then when we were fighting those battles. He said, it is not about whether or not we're going to use the land. It's about who is going to use the land. And, we fell into that where the pressure on us was because we owned the water. It wasn't because cows were drinking the water. It's because we owned the water, and higher powers wanted to have control of that water. So that's really what we were talking about. The conservation issues, trying to paint the rancher as the bad guy and destroying the earth is, first off, the science doesn't support it. There is no science behind that. And that. It's exactly the opposite that is true. And that's what we have to remember in these battles. We have to be focused on what is the real agenda. What are they really after, so that we know how to fight it? And 30 by 30 is not about conservation. That's what they're trying to paint it as. But it is about transferring control of the property from America's private landowners into the administrative state that is controlled by the environmental community. So that's what it's about, because if they truly were interested in conservation of the lands, then they would make sure that every acre of America had a committed landowner living off that land, taking care of that land, because those are your best lands in America, are the lands where people live off that land because they take care of it.
Somebody that has some skin in the game, a vested interest in making sure that this is better tomorrow than it is today, because of the way that I'm taking care of it.
Absolutely. I tell a story sometimes. I love reading our founders' letters, and Thomas Jefferson was such a great writer. But he tells this story of one time when he was walking through the French countryside as an ambassador. And he met up with this very, very poor lady who was walking to the next town, just trying to find some day labor to make a few dollars to feed her family. And He ends up giving her a few coins, and she just breaks down crying because she had never seen that kind of generosity. But what he talked about in his letter was how, as they were walking to this town, they were walking through the king's lands, saw this beautiful land that, beautiful forests and meadows and all this land that was set aside. And this very poor woman couldn't have gone on that land and picked up a stick of firewood because it would have been illegal. And he saw the injustice because she represented the populace of France. And he saw the injustice that when land is controlled by the administrative state, by the federal government, by the kings and the lords, and not the people, that it puts people in poverty. They can't take care of themselves. And so he writes back to his friend, James Madison, who's not the James Madison that we're familiar with. It's Reverend James Madison. And he says, the small landowner is the most important part of the state. And that is the reason, because that small landowner can take care of himself and can take care of his community and can take care of his nation. And it's just a really interesting letter. And it is so true today. And that is what the Biden administration is trying to extinguish, is the small landowner having control over his lands, being able to decide what he's going to grow and how to best use his lands. That's what 30 by 30 is extinguishing.
Yeah, so let's get into that. We've thrown the term around, 30 by 30. I'm sure many people have heard of it, heard it talked about, maybe seen it in headlines, which isn't always the most reliable place to get truth about a given initiative or agenda. So what is it? What is 30 by 30? Where did it come from? And what is the stated goal? What is the public goal? And how are you guys looking at it?
Well, 30 by 30 is a very radical environmental agenda to permanently protect 30% of our nation, our lands and our oceans in its natural state by 2030. So we're talking now 8.5 years, 30% of our land. And as the Nebraska Governor Ricketts says, that's one state in Nebraska every year for the next 9 years, or 2 states of Texas. That's a lot of land. Mm. That is the environmental agenda, permanently protected in its natural state, and that means no use. Now, 30 by 30, first off, there's a couple things that people need to understand. It's being sold to us as if it is a locally driven program. The first thing to understand is this was not a program that was devised by you or me or American citizens. This is an international agenda. You can Google it and you will see that 30 by 30 is being forced on every nation across the globe. So 30 by 30 is an international agenda that is being pushed on and pushed in on America by the Biden administration. The other thing that is happening, largely because the people have pushed back on this, is when they first unleashed this January 27th in the President's Executive Order 14008, which is where they first initiated 30 by 30 in America. When they first did this, it was called 30 by 30. You could go to all the environmental websites and they all had something up on their website about this great 30 by 30 program. Today, because of the pushback from the people, when they started hearing about this, they realized how radical it was and they didn't buy into it and they pushed back on it. And, we came out right in the beginning and labeled it a land grab. And that kind of took off in the press and has been in a lot of articles. And so they've now come out and they've rebranded it to conserve and restore America the Beautiful. And they're trying to remarket it as a locally driven program that is here to help our farmers and our ranchers do more with their land, to conserve it and keep working lands working. And that's the misdirect. That's what they need to have landowners buy into that program and to that way of thinking in order to get control of the land. They need them to voluntarily sign up for these conservation programs. But the ultimate agenda is to permanently protect 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030. And I hate to say this, but that's the short-term goal. Mm. What they're really pursuing is something called the half-earth philosophy, which is 50% that they want permanently protected. And we've already seen, just in this month, we've seen the New Mexico governor sign an executive order to usher in 30 by 30 in New Mexico. And it calls for the 30%, like we've been talking about, the 30% of land conserved in that. But it also includes another 20% for climate stabilization zones, I think is how she says it. So we're now at 50% in New Mexico is what the New Mexico governor is pushing for. So it's coming. You know, when it was first dropped on the American people, not a lot of people caught it because of the way that it was done. We'd been actually following 30 by 30 for several months and studying it. We had read all the background material on it. We were convinced that it would become a flagship policy of the Biden administration. That's why we focused so much on it. We did our first article on it, I think, the day after the inauguration to get our people aware of it. And so when it came out, we were ready. We knew what it was. We were able to get a pretty good ground game going quickly. We worked with the Garfield County, Colorado. They prepared the very first local government resolution to oppose this and passed it 3 weeks later. And at the same time, we released the first guide to fight 30 by 30, which lays out the agenda and gives landowners some tools to fight back against this, and started just getting people educated on 30 by 30.
So let's just think about it practically for a minute. I'm here in Western South Dakota, and we are number 23 in descending order of the amount of federally owned land at 5.4% just across the border from me. In Montana, they are at 11. They're 11th on the list at 29%. So the 50, the half earth agenda notwithstanding, does Montana, so to speak, have less to worry about because they're only 1% away from 30, and South Dakota have more to worry about because we're 25 or 24.6% away from 30? I mean, let's think about it practically. Can you help us think about it that way?
Sure. So the 30% is not about land ownership. So it's not about how much land the federal government owns. It's the level of restrictions on the land. So what they say in their material is currently in America, 12% of the land in America is protected at the level that they want to see the 30%. So what makes up that 12%? We know what that is. That is wilderness areas, which are the let it burn areas where there's no management. It really becomes a monoculture. That's the areas in California that are burning up, in the West that burn up. Mm-hmm. It is our national parks, state parks, and importantly, on private land, it is private lands with permanent conservation easements. Those are the main things that make up the 12%. So what we're talking about very restricted lands. If you have wilderness lands, national park lands, those are not lands that we get to use. They are very limited in any kind of use. And when the executive order was signed on January 27th, where 30 by 30 was checked into it, that's the 57-page executive order. This was section 216. It's 2 paragraphs. It was missed by a lot of people. And when that was set in, though, the Department of Interior came out that same day and with some more information on how they plan to implement 30 by 30. And that's where they included in that material the 12% figure. So we know what they were targeting at that point. Now that the people have started pushing back against this, they're starting to say that they really don't know how to define conserve, and they really aren't sure exactly what lands are included. They know exactly what they are targeting, and it's the most restricted lands. There's a report issued by the Center for American Progress that is very good to look into and read to understand 30 by 30 from the environmental perspective and what the administration is really proposing here. And it's a report called How Much Nature Should America Keep? It was published in August of 2019. And this sets forth the agenda for 30 by 30 in America, and most of the environmental literature ties back to this. The Department of Interior fact sheet on 30 by 30 took verbiage almost cut and paste from this and in their fact sheet. So we know that that's really what they're focused on. And that's an excellent report to really get an understanding of what this is. And in there, you see a lot of different things. You see particularly that there's a huge focus on controlling private land. They are targeting lands that are high biodiversity and are being productively used now. They say that, three-quarters of the land that is being converted from its natural state to development today is happening on private lands, but only 1% of that is protected. And that's something they are really seeking to change. So that's why you will see in all their material, see this huge push for more conservation easements in perpetuity on private land, because that gives them the control over the land that they are seeking. And there's a huge push to get more landowners into conservation reserve programs, CRP programs, EQIP, all of those kind of programs, because that creates a federal connection to the private land that then gives them a tool to restrict down the road when they want to pull that lever. So, even though your state does not have a high amount of federal land in it, and even though Montana has a little bit more, it's not about land ownership. It's about the level of restrictions that are on the land. And that's what we really have to watch out for. So, nobody is safe from the agenda.
So even if there are, BLM lands in eastern Montana and Forest Service lands in western Montana, and those currently have grazing allotments on them, part of the 30 by 30 would be to restrict the use of that land by agriculturalists generally. Am I understanding you right?
Yes. So the CAP report explains that their definition of what lands qualify under 30 by 30 is extractive uses, productive uses cannot be on the land. So that means basically no use of the land. We are talking about 30% of our land that nobody is supposed to use.
So, but that's working out so well in California, as you alluded to.
Well, progressive policies have a history of failure, but that doesn't keep people from wanting to put them in place. And again, you have to think about it. If that's a very good point to make. If conservation was their agenda. But conservation isn't their agenda. It's about controlling the land.
Yeah. And that was my dad just called me, and he was, I'll try to be general about this. He was at a meeting of a certain government agency, and one of the individuals who sits on a national level board from South Dakota for that agency spoke up, and she's from South Dakota, and she said, what my perspective on this is that they have confused the terms conserve and preserve in regards to the 30 by 30, that they are not trying to conserve things. They're trying to preserve them from any impact really at all. Kind of like we see these nature preserves and these kinds of things. They're trying to go more that direction than they are actual conservation. Is that
that is 100% correct. Very accurate. And that's what you will get that out of that Center for American Progress report. That becomes very clear. And really that was the direction the administration was headed in their initial materials. But with the pushback, they started kind of changing their marketing approach to this. And when they came out with the America the Beautiful rebranding of 30 by 30 in May, in that they say that they're not talking about protection. They're talking about conserving lands, and they want to make that very clear. But then they say it's too hard to define what they mean by conserve. Now, I don't buy that. All their material is pretty clear on what they see as what lands they want to the level of restrictions that they want to have on these lands. But the general public will buy that. they will buy that this is just about conservation. And that's why the America the Beautiful report has nothing substantive really about implementation and what they plan to do. It's a PR marketing piece to try to get the general public on board behind this great idea. So, it is definitely about preserve and not conserve. And here's another thing, that if you really want to understand what the agenda is about, watch the people. So who has the Biden administration put in place? The author of that CAP report, there's actually two. There's a follow-up. The second one is called The Green Squeeze, is written by a Matt Lee Ashley. Matt Lee Ashley is currently the chief of staff for the Council on Environmental Quality. And the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality is now pretty much the one who is in charge of the National Climate Task Force, which is overseeing the 30 by 30 agenda. So you have the author of the CAP report as chief of staff in the White House with the cabinet level position in our government that is overseeing America the Beautiful. And we're supposed to believe they don't know how to define conserve.
The green squeeze sounds, that's pretty subtle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're two very interesting reports. When you go through it, us who've been in agriculture and, we've been on the land, we know a little bit more about these things than maybe people in the cities. And you read some of these things and your mouth just drops. For instance, it's based on this belief that, based on models that these great climate crisis scientists have done, they believe that over the coming decades, 1 million species will go extinct, and 1/3 of all species in America will go extinct in the coming decades. Therefore, we must permanently protect 30% of our lands. When the New Mexico EO came out, I got a text from somebody that we work very closely with. And, I said, it's 20% for climate stabilization. And he said, what is climate stabilization? And I kind of had to laugh, because what I really wanted to say is they just make this stuff up as they go. It's not based on science. And so, to tell them what that really means, I don't know that I can, because I don't know that they can tell us what that means.
Yeah, right. And the other thing that sticks out to me from the other report you were mentioning is how much land should America keep? Well, again, back to the founding, that it kind of flies in the face of the founding of America, that there isn't really publicly held land necessarily. I mean, it wasn't until the progressive era and the national parks that we started to get some more of that, but the founding was, as you said earlier, kind of unique in world history as far as the idea of private property ownership and some of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That report, how much nature should America keep? And that's really where they're making that distinction, to try to erode the property rights argument and, sell the notion that because we all breathe the same air, they should have a right to tell us what to do with our property. And that, that's kind of where they're headed with that. But, yeah, we were intended to be a nation built on private property rights, because that's how we're able to protect our individual freedom and have individual liberties. Another thing that Thomas Jefferson said in a letter was, in America, every man should be king. Every man should own his own land, have that right. And that's really, really key and important, and something we have to protect.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, the conservation reserve programs, and some of and easements and some of those things. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the everyday dangers, or maybe the back doors into this kind of a program or fulfilling this agenda?
Yeah, the biggest concern that I think landowners should have about these conservation reserve programs and EQIP and some of those programs is is we know that we're now in an administration that intends to permanently protect 30% of America's lands. Okay, that we know, that's their overall policy. So you may have felt pretty comfortable signing up under those programs when you were in the Trump administration, which was, less regulation, more productivity, definitely, helping the landowner as opposed to wanting to control the land. It's now different. So that dynamic has changed. So we're going to see different policies. But let me give you an example of how a federal connection is attached to the land under those programs. So when a species is listed and critical habitat is designated for the protection of that species, critical habitat does not apply to private land. Okay, so that's great, unless there is a federal connection to that land. And a federal connection can be federal funding, a federal program, or anything that needs federal approval, like a wetlands permit. So now, if you have your private property and you put it in CRP, enrolled in CRP for 10 years, and now they come along and they say, hey, the swift fox is endangered, and they put it on the endangered species list and they designate critical habitat, and your land is included in that. Now your property does apply under that critical habitat designation, and you may be restricted under it. So that's kind of but if you don't have that funding on your land, then those restrictions aren't going to apply to you because they can't apply to private property unless there's that federal connection. So the thing that landowners need to understand is that those laws are already there. Those laws can already be utilized. The Biden administration doesn't have to go to Congress to get a new law to do that. It already says that. They already have that ability. And what the White House has shared is that they plan to use all the tools in the toolbox to implement 30 by 30. So they're taking every program they have, every authority they have, and they are looking at it from the perspective of how do we use this to get to the 30%.
What about easements? A lot of times those are pitched as a private, a voluntary program that's kind of handled privately. Can you talk about some of the easements and different ways those are handled and some of the things to watch out for there?
The conservation easements in perpetuity, they're sold to the landowner as being a really good tool, something that helps them keep the land working, reduce their taxes, be able to pass it on to their kids without it being developed. I mean, it's sold in a way that most landowners find it very appealing. But the land trusts don't have to tell you the downside, neither does the federal government. So one of the first things to understand about a conservation easement in perpetuity is you are selling control of your land to that land trust. So in other words, you're selling the development right. And the conservation purpose, which it now becomes the priority for the management of that land. So you may be able to keep it in agriculture, but the conservation purpose that is held by the land trust is now the controlling element of that land. So your agriculture operation freezes. You sign a conservation easement. You can do everything on that property that you're doing today. So you can still raise cattle if you're doing that. You can still grow hay if you're doing that. But in kind of simplistic language, that use is frozen. So you can repair a fence, but maybe not put a new fence in somewhere else. You can repair a barn, but if you need to move it, maybe not put it in somewhere else. You can't do that. A good example, and actually in a place in Sydney, Montana, a landowner up there was showing me how this area around the Yellowstone River that goes through their really good meadowlands where they grow a lot of hay. 10 years prior, they were flood irrigating that. And now everybody has pivots on that. Well, if they had conservation easements in, they couldn't have put the pivot in. So that's what happens to the agriculture unit, is the agriculture use freezes. Now, how can anybody in agriculture make a living 10 years from now if you're not flexible? make changes that occur with weather, that occur with technology. There is nobody in agriculture that can operate stagnant and survive. And so the easement, the very nature of the easement, puts the agriculture operation out of business eventually. So that's one of the first things to understand. The second thing is that the control of that easement, the priority now is that conservation purpose. So if that conservation purpose is to, say, protect habitat for the American burying beetle, then that's what's going to trump everything. Meaning you may have to quit running as many cows as you did if it's impacting that beetle. That's what happens, is that conservation purpose now is the dominant control of the property. So that's why we say that it is a property right. When you sign that conservation easement, that is your property right to sign that conservation easement. But once you sign that conservation easement, it's no longer a private property right, because the fundamental right to property is the ability to control it, and you have just sold that right. That is the reason why conservation easements in perpetuity are included in the 12% of lands in America that are permanently protected in their natural state. I mean, that should scare people.
Yeah. How does that transfer, that enforcement transfer from private to public, so that, a beetle or the swift fox or whatever can become, the feds can have an interest in protecting those on those lands when that was a private voluntary, contract signed? Where does that link come? Is there some federal funding that was behind that, or how does that link happen?
Well, to get the tax deduction. So here's the process. When you sign a conservation easement, with the land trust. They come up with what the conservation purpose is for that land. That conservation purpose has to meet a specific definition that is in the IRS code in order to get the tax deduction. So, like, specifically, no mining is in the code. I mean, specifically, the way that the IRS has written it, in order to get the tax deduction, because the IRS is giving you a tax deduction for that, then there has to be a guarantee that certain activities are not going to happen on that land. And that's very specific in the IRS code. And so when you take a look at that and you read that and you realize, okay, if all of these things now I have sold and I can't do on my property, I've just sold the fundamental control of my property. I no longer control it. The land trust does, or if the easement is held by the federal government does. So that's what happens. That's why you've given that away. So in Nebraska, the Department of Revenue has found that when a conservation easement is placed on a piece of land, the value of that land drops by 49%.
Yeah.
So that's telling you that value of that land is gone. So those entities now control that conservation purpose. They can come out onto your land whenever they want to monitor and make sure you're doing things according to that conservation purpose. The conservation purpose is written into the contract, and a lot of times it'll say, let's say it's to protect habitat. The conservation purpose of this easement is to protect habitat for the American burying beetle. And then it'll say, and so we will comply with all U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conservation measures to protect the American burying beetle. Well, now, whatever the Fish and Wildlife says has to be done to protect the beetle now has to happen on that private property with the easement. Up to and including
removing agricultural activity.
Yeah, exactly. So even though, there is a guarantee that the agriculture use is going to be able to stay and you can continue to do that forever, the practicality of that is when there's a conflict between the conservation purpose and the agriculture use, it's the agriculture use that's going to give because the conservation purpose has the priority.
Yeah. No, very, very good. So would you say that there are some that you could read and find good, or is it just kind of stay away from them as a general rule?
I think stay away from them as a general rule. Number one, why would you tie up your land in perpetuity and make a decision on a piece of property that your children, grandchildren, their grandchildren are forever beholden to?
Yeah.
Growing up in the West and on a federal land grazing operation, I got a firsthand look at what it's like to try to run a business with the federal government as your business partner telling you what to do.
Yep.
And that's the same situation people are putting their kids into with a conservation easement in perpetuity. And you have to remember, too, it's only the first generation that gets the benefit. So you will either get an income tax break one time, or you're going to get the estate tax break. And then once that's done, that's done. They forever own the development rights of your property, and you forever are restricted on what you can do on your land. So, it just does not make any sense. I think, the first thing, if you're interested in looking at those, the first thing you want to do is don't do it in perpetuity. Do something to where, at least in 30 years, your kids can decide if they want to re-sign up or not. Right. That's like the Conservation Reserve Program is a 10-year program. Eventually, you can be out of that. So it's not as nefarious as a conservation easement in perpetuity. Those are forever. They're forever.
Yeah. And you mentioned, again, the Conservation Reserve Program being a 10-year deal. Is that, do the strings come off in 10 years? So say the Swift Fox is an issue, year 14 after my 10-year contract. 4 years later, it becomes an issue in my area. They can't come back on that. Then am I understanding that right?
Yeah, once the contract is over and there's no more federal funds attached to it, then yeah, you should be in good shape. But the other thing you have to look at is there kind of what we're seeing is there's the Conservation Reserve Program, which is like a first cut into it. But there's other ways, programs like that the federal agencies have devised to get landowners into it. So let's say that there's the listing of an endangered species and they're designating critical habitat. I'll use the lesser prairie chicken in New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas. They have, when they first worked to list that about 10 years ago, we actually were involved in that case and got that listing reversed through some of the counties that we work with. But when they were first working on that, they were saying the reason they had to list was because there's not enough conservation measures on private land. Private land didn't have the layers of protection on it to assure that the lesser prairie chicken would be fine. So they set up all these candidate conservation agreements where a landowner could voluntarily sign up under these CCA programs. And when they did, they would have to agree to all the restrictions as if they were regulated anyway. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service said, okay, if we do list it, then you can still, do what you're doing, and you will get a take permit to do it. So it's kind of nefarious. It's like they have a conservation program sitting there waiting to force landowners into, whether it be through all the devices that they have. And so I think some of the main thing to understand is do everything you can as a landowner to eliminate all the federal ties and restrictions to your lands that you possibly can. That is just the safest, most comfortable position to be in, because there are just so many different ways that they can that they can attach restrictions to the property, and they're getting more and more every day. So, and especially under this administration, we're going to see all those things being used, all those tools in the toolbox. So I know I'm getting a little convoluted and maybe a little bit too in the weeds for what people are understanding at this point. But the simplest advice I can give you is do everything you can to avoid federal connection to your land. Yeah,
no, I think that I appreciate that. I appreciate your time today. What about resources? You mentioned the CAP reports. Are there some other resources that kind of would be a good analytical tool for those reports?
A couple other reports, you ought to look at the Defenders of Wildlife. They've put out a couple different reports on 30 by 30 with, they even have, they include the gap map. So the gap map is the USGS map, and I show this in our presentations, which shows the 12% that is restricted, where it's mapped. USGS has been mapping for, I think, over probably, I know over 20 years because we've been following them that long, where they have mapped the level of restrictions on land in America. Take a look at that map. That's in the Defender's Report. They have a lot of kind of direction in there of how, as an organization, where they think land should be conserved. And that'll give you a little bit of a heads up on what may be coming into your area. Again, it's not full of substance. There's not a lot of stuff that you can really that's specifically substantively where you could attack it through, say, a court case or something like that. But it will give you a sense of where the environmentalists are headed. And I think that's just really important. The thing that we have to do to beat 30 by 30 is they're going to implement it locally. They're going to implement it in everybody's community in a different way. And so you've got to protect your home front, be watchful of these programs coming into your area, get organized. That's why, we have really pushed and requested that local governments pass a local government resolution opposing 30 by 30 that helps you get organized. It puts you on the map. The environmentalists like to go in places of least resistance. That's important. And it allows you guys to gather and defend each other and defend your home front. If communities all across the West will do that, it's going to be very hard for them to accomplish 30 by 30.
Very good. So as far as links, this will be workingcows.net/209, show notes page for today, workingcows.net/209. I'll have links up there to americanstewards.us. Any others and I'll throw a link to your video, the video of your talk at RCAF. Props to RCAF for having good production value there and getting the slides up on the screen, and it was well done, and I appreciate that. So it's a good video to watch and get some more of the details here. But any other links outside of the CAP report, the Defenders of Wildlife, any other links that I should throw up there?
I think those really are the two core, because those, you go through those and you will get a really good understanding of 30 by 30. If you want to get a good scare, then look at the Half Earth philosophy, the Half Earth Agenda, E.O. Wilson, and also to see how real this really is being implemented in America. The New Mexico governor's executive order is another one to take a look at. Well, she's actively working to make that happen in New Mexico within her authority, which fortunately is a little limited.
Right.
So.
And that one flies in the face because they're way over 30%. I mean, flies in the face of the idea that it's just 30% of each state, so to speak, because they're way over 30% now. And it's more about, like you said, restriction.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That's a good.
That comes through pretty clear.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's a great discussion, and I appreciate that. Are there allies in this fight? Or organizations, just come right out and say it. I'm a member of South Dakota Farm Bureau's Young Farmers and Ranchers Committee. And I believe that there are organizations like that, like South Dakota Farm Bureau, or Farm Bureau in general, that are a powerful voice. Now, it's up to the membership to direct those voices in a profitable direction. But are there allies in this fight, or are there ways to get involved? You mentioned locally is probably the place to start. But are there or would you like to say we were kind of disappointed in some organizations and say this is a way that we could direct them more profitably?
Yes, you nailed it. Number one, these agriculture organizations are member driven. So what we find is that they usually are very good and very active on these kind of issues at the local level. So the county farm bureaus and some of the state farm bureaus have been really good on this. Nebraska Farm Bureau has been very good and has opposed 30 by 30. But getting that to trickle up to the national groups has been very difficult. So in other words, both the American Farm Bureau and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association have been straddling the fence on this. They didn't want to come out and oppose it. And in particular, they've taken this position that that the Biden administration has incorporated their viewpoint into the America the Beautiful plan, because it says in there that they're going to protect property rights. Well, here's a few things to understand. Number one, you can read the CAP report that we've been talking about, and it says in there that it's going to protect property rights. It has to say that because that's the only way to get Americans' private lands is voluntarily from the landowners. The second part of that is, it's not up to the Biden administration nor any other organization to say we have property rights. The Constitution already guarantees that. The Biden administration can't take those away without violating the Constitution. So exactly what did they win for us? Really nothing. So everything that is in that report that and I've listened to some of it and I've thought, what they say that they protected and they got into this the America the Beautiful report, it's already in the environmental literature on 30 by 30 that's been there since 2019. So they really haven't won us anything. The other thing, I think a really important message is agriculture could absolutely stop this if agriculture would stand up and fight against this. And we have to really think about the times that we're in. This is not a time for Chamberlain. This is a time for Churchill. Standing on the fence on this one is not a good place to be. We are the main menu item on this. The environmentalists have absolutely nothing to give in this battle. America's landowners are being asked to give up everything. What are we gaining from them on 30 by 30? What is the give and take? There is no give and take. There's all take. And it's take from people who don't have any skin in the game. They're not trying to conserve their property. They're trying to conserve your property. So our national agriculture organizations really need to step up to the plate on this. And that's one reason I'm really pleased to see, our CAF jumped into this immediately and took an immediate stance opposing this. I was really, really pleased to see that. But we really need to put a little toughness into our other agriculture organizations to really help us. And I would say that a different way, but I'm going to be really polite. So would you be willing to help write a resolution to that effect? For the organizations?
Yeah.
Well, we do have the local government resolution that we have out, and it's up on our website where anybody can download that. They can download the Guide to Fight for free. It's all free. There's a model resolution, and there's the Guide to Fight, which gives a lot of information on that. And that's what counties all across the nation have been passing. They've been modifying that resolution, and I think we're close to 100 counties that have passed that resolution opposing across the nation right now, which is pretty good. But the other one, and just, advice to your listeners, is get to your associations, educate them on 30 by 30. There are so many people that just don't know about this. And once they learn about it, they're pretty shocked. So doing that education is really important. NRA was one that I mentioned where they came out and they actually supported 30 by 30. As long as their members could continue to have access to the lands to hunt and fish. Mm-hmm. So that was not good. That was not a good position for them to take. And I do know we reported on it. And about 2 weeks later, we started hearing from callers that NRA had now taken the position that they didn't say that they didn't have that statement. So they were kind of backing away from that. But you can go in, there's a report called Hunt and Fish 30 by 30. And you can go in and see all the signatories on that report, and NRA is a signatory. They have not come off of that. So they definitely support this program, unfortunately.
Sure. Well, Margaret, I appreciate your time today. Any other major nuggets we left on the table or anything else that you would like to share before I let you go?
No, I think they were good questions, and I think we got into the weeds on a few things, which is always good. So I appreciate the interview and your time as well, and your help getting people educated on this.
Sure. Very much appreciate it. Thanks for joining me today, Margaret.
My pleasure.
Very good stuff there with Margaret. Really appreciate her perspective and her taking it back to the founding and her understanding of these issues, and looking forward to some of the future episodes we got coming out. Really looking forward to next week. We're going to talk to longtime friend of the Working Cows podcast, Aaron Berger, about what it means or what we need to pay attention to when we are looking at our ranch businesses as a side hustle, as I do. My full-time job is to pastor the people of Prairie Home Church. I got a few side hustles, one of them being the ranch and the land that's been entrusted to me. And there are countless listeners of the Working Cows podcast who find themselves in the same spot. One of them reached out to me via email and asked me to do an episode about these things. And so I reached out to Aaron and asked him to share his thoughts. And so we're going to do that for episode 210 of the Working Cows podcast, coming your way real soon.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.